My name is Dr. Rosanne Welch. I am a teacher of screenwriting and screenwriting history. I was a television producer for several years, and I wrote a book about the Monkees because when I was 6, I married Mickey in my basement. So I have loved them all my life. I had to take Mickey because my cousin chose Davy, and we couldn't fight, right? So anyway, I've always been interested in them and what they're about. And in studying television and writing about television, I started to realize that the show was about much more than 4 kids kicking around trying to be a band. In fact, I realized there was a lot more political stuff, there was a lot more early messaging that began to change sort of the form and the things that we would see on television in the coming years. So that's what I studied, that's the book. Obviously I have copies, they're 25 bucks if you're free at the end and interested. But we're gonna talk about the Monkees. So first thing is a little bit of who I am. On television I wrote for Touched by an Angel, Beverly Hills 90210, and Picket Fences, and NBC's News Nightline. When I decided to get into academia and start writing, first of all, the Monkees book, obviously, but then I've written a lot of stuff about women in history, women in popular culture, very interested in that, and you'll be hopefully interested in finding out that there is some things to be said about feminism on the Monkees in the 60s, which nobody would have expected until I studied it. I also do book reviews for the Journal of Screenwriting. I'm their book review editor, and I work on Written by Magazine on the editorial board. That's a magazine for members of the Writers Guild. So my deep focus is generally words matter, writers matter, and women writers matter. And we're going to find out that on the Monkees there was the first female television writer who didn't need a male partner in order to have a job, which sounds a little crazy to us today, but was true back in the day. I got very involved in this when I wrote an article for Written By about the Monkees, the writers of the Monkees. I wanted to find out who are these people who had stories to tell and who were telling their philosophy through these 4 characters, right? And so that really interested me. And these are most of the folks that I got to meet. Obviously, when I met them, they were in their late 70s, had been around for a while, and they have some marvelous stories to tell. Gerald Gardner, the gentleman just to the left of my book picture, was actually a scriptwriter and a speechwriter for Robert Kennedy's Senate campaign in New York. He came to television through a show called That Was the Week That Was, which was kind of the SNL weekend update of its time. And then he moved to Get Smart, and when they started the Monkees, the folks in charge were like, we need some cool, funny young men, and he and his partner showed up. So that's Gerald Gardner. Down in the right corner is Peter Meyerson, clearly from his photograph, truly on the hippie train back in the day, had a very interesting life, and ended up married to one of Michael Nesmith's early girlfriends later in life. Like his 3rd wife was Nesmith's first girlfriend or some silly thing like that. The gentleman in the middle is Bernie Orenstein. He was a writer of more mainstream work and had a lot to say about what the Monkees were about. Dave Evans, the gentleman who's smiling, he's so adorable. He's the nicest man you would ever want to meet. And he had written for Bullwinkle before he came to the Monkees. And then Treva Silverin is the woman I was speaking of, the first woman to write on television, write comedy without a male partner. And so she went on to earn 2 Emmys in her career, writing on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. So all these writers had very good histories coming into and then moving out of the Monkees. And again, people dismiss the show, but it really deserves much more attention. She wrote the particular episode of Mary Tyler Moore where Lou Grant's wife asked for a divorce, which was huge in the early 70s, and that's what she got the Emmy for. So these folks changed, I say, the face of television. Before 1966, we're having a lot of first of all, very white folks, but also very sort of middle of the road, very gentle, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's all one flavor. There's not a whole lot of difference there, right? If you'll notice in the bottom corner, who do you think that is? Mickey Dolenz was a TV star. People think they were nobodies coming to the show, but Mickey Dolenz himself had a show for 3 years because his parents were performers, right? And they had a friend who said, we're doing this show called Circus Boy. Would your kid dye his hair blonde to be in it? And his parents were like, yeah, that's good. That's a college fund right there. So this is TV before our folks showed up, and this is TV after. And it's definitely different. Suddenly we're talking about on Laugh-In, sex, politics, what's going on in the world. We have Sonny and Cher, who a couple of the writers from the Monkees moved on to the Sonny and Cher show. If you know enough about the Monkees, there were 2 seasons of the program. The 3rd season, the 4 guys wanted it to be a variety show set around rock and roll. And the problem was the network said, nobody's going to watch a variety show. It has to do with rock and roll. And the next season, Sonny and Cher showed up and won some Emmys, right? So there you go. Of course, the Smothers Brothers, who were canceled for being too political. The Mod Squad, which was a whole movement into the new hippie generation. And of course, All in the Family is going to happen in the 70s, and we're going to get very serious about how we talk about politics on television. But the Monkees were there in the beginning. If you think about it, we know that Dr. Timothy Leary, who was famous for dropping a little acid back in the day, he already was watching the program and saying, this is a whole lot going on here that no one else is paying attention to. So this isn't information that I invented years later. People already were saying these things, but the network television guys weren't really listening. They thought it was a show about 4 guys who wanted to be a band. And there was a good way to sell music. It was synergy, right? It was the big word of the day. So that's what they thought. But when you think about what they were talking about on the show, this particular song, Randy Scouse Git, is a song that Mickey wrote. It hit #1 on the charts in the UK. It made it to like #3 in the charts in the United States. Came in the 2nd season. Also in the 2nd season, their clothing began to change. They went from J.C. Penney matching band uniforms to the poncho, the more hippie attire, looking more like they looked in their real lives. In this case, obviously you've read the lyrics. It's some pretty amazing stuff to be on mainstream television in the middle of what was the beginning, I should say, of the Vietnam War and how it was affecting everybody. That's a pretty bold thing for anybody, I have to say, which I think is amazing. Then there was actually a movement to not draft Davy Jones. So girls wrote letters and what sort of thing, which I think is adorable. He was an Englishman, but he was here in the country working, and so therefore could have been drafted, and so that was interesting. Mickey received a draft notice. Mike had already been in the military, so they couldn't draft him back. And Peter as well received one. Peter pretended to be crazy when he went to his interview, and they believed it. So this is a line from one of the episodes that was written by Coslow Johnson about politics. And the idea that, you know, what was going on with teenagers, they're the ones doing all the fighting, but we didn't say where they were fighting, right? We were sending them to fight. So there's a lot happening about politics in this early day. This is a particular moment in the show that shocks me that got onto network television at that time. They're playing dominoes, as you can see, and at one point when all the dominoes fall down, Davy says to Peter, what do you call this game? And Peter says, Southeast Asia. Which, if you know about the domino theory of communism, and the censors didn't cut that. And a lot of times it's because Trevor Silverman said the network people didn't understand the joke. They didn't get it because they were an older generation of men, all men, and they didn't see what was going on. So that to me is an amazing thing to have gotten away with what they did. Television mattered to the Monkees, both the writers and of course the performers. They understood that it was this giant place, this giant podium from which to send out a message to everybody. And they knew that was important. This is a quote by Peter, obviously. Who knows who said behind him? Janis Joplin. These guys were friends. So there's also this ridiculous myth that nobody in music liked the Monkees back then. That's all not true. They lived in Laurel Canyon, which is an area right above Hollywood. They had houses next to Mama Cass Elliot. Eric Clapton lived in the neighborhood. Frank Zappa bought a house there eventually. John Lennon would visit Mickey Dolenz' home all the time because Mickey had married a woman from England. And Lennon and Ringo, the Beatles obviously, made the joke that that was the house they could go to where somebody knew how to serve tea at 4 o'clock. So, you know, they were just English guys hanging out in America. So, but Peter, very much against the character he was asked to play, which of course was the dummy. He was a very intellectual, very smart gentleman, and saw right from the start that their message would actually have more power than the Beatles. The thing about TV is it comes into everybody's house for free. Granted, now we pay for cable, but back then it was free. To see a movie with a new idea, you had to pay money. And not everybody could do that, certainly not younger children. So these ideas are coming into homes where they can affect more people, and I think Peter was very right about that. I love this. This is a shot of the entire cast and crew. So you can see the guys sitting in several places in front, and then there's the gentleman to the left of the camera by 2 holding the coffee cup. That's James Frawley. He's going to win an Emmy for Best Directing in this first season. So this is an Emmy-winning show, not just Emmy-nominated. It won as Best Comedy of the Year, and it won for Best Directing. James Frawley will grow up to direct the Muppet movie and many, many other things. So he's been involved in the business for a long time, and this was his first directing job. So again, quality people putting together a quality show. I think if the show had stayed on longer and we've gotten more understanding of it, we'd be looking at essentially this is the Big Bang Theory, except they're not 4 nerds, they're 4 rock and roll kids, right? But that's what it's all about. So yes, there's him winning his Emmy, and in winning it, he thanked the actors. He knew that it was the attention paid to the actors that got everyone to notice the show. So I think that's pretty cool. Now, remember I said, before 1966, right? So let's think about after 1966, how these people affected the world. The messages they put in the show shocked me in some ways. I recognized the politics, I kind of expected it, I vaguely remembered it. I was afraid going back to study the show, being someone who studies feminist things, it was going to be really annoying when it comes to girls, and I'd be really embarrassed, and I wouldn't want to like the show anymore. And then I noticed that every single female that they ever dated in 58 episodes was a woman of substance. Now, granted, she's the princess of harmonica, so we can giggle at that. But at a moment in the episode, Davy says, "Can't you stay here with me? The dream of every American girl." And she says, "No, I have to return to my country. I have responsibilities. I have a job to do. I can't just fall for a cute boy and quit." Which is a huge statement for a little 6- and 7-year-old girl to be listening to. You mean I should be about something? And I really think that a lot of the seeds, certainly of my feminism, came from this period. So every girl on the show that we meet, they have a job. Jill is in the pilot. She works at the record store. She has a job. She sells records. She understands what the new music is. She's working with the band, trying to get them more attention. She's a girl of substance. I had no idea. I really thought they'd all be cheerleaders and they'd be bubbleheads and I'd be upset, right? April in The Monkees Get Out More Dirt is, who's the actress? Julie Newmar from, we mostly know from Catwoman from the original Batman. In this episode, all 4 boys fall for her, but what they learn is the way to a woman's heart is through her mind. So each of them takes on, one learns ballet, one learns classical music, one learns painting. They all learn something intellectual to impress her. It's not about, look at me, I'm hot, you should like me, right? I think that's adorable. I mean, it's all done in farce and cuteness, but underneath it, it could easily have been cheerleaders. Not to, insult any cheerleaders in the world, but we don't do them well in the media, right? We make them out to be not very smart. So that really struck me. In this episode, poor Mickey wants to go out with this girl, and she falls for a big, beefy guy for a while, so he's trying to get stronger. He's trying to do everything to make her like him. He doesn't want her because she's blonde and pretty. He wants her because she's beautiful and brilliant. That's what makes her an attractive girl to him. That's a really nice message for young girls, right? And in the end, the girl dumps him because she meets a boy on the beach who reads Proust. And she thinks, I want a man with a mom. So only Mickey has done some reading. But I think that's, again, a creative message. And then this episode, Some Like It Lukewarm, is very famous. Obviously, it's a riff on Some Like It Hot. But they do a rock band contest, and it turns out you have to be a co-ed band. So, of course, Davy has to dress in drag. We find out that the girl band, actually the girl is also dressed as a boy in order to compete. This is actually Dean Martin's daughter, Deanna Martin. Guest starred on the show, became a good friend to David Jones for many years. Dean Martin he was very mad when the Beatles started to rise up the charts, and people were like, okay, your music is dead, Dad. That's what his kid said to him. And he said, you watch. And his next album knocked the Beatles off the charts. And it was the one with Everybody Loves Somebody Sometimes. So exactly, and I love Dean, so there you go. So anyway, in this episode, it works because they're showing us a girl rock band, which was a little odd at the time. There were individual female singer-songwriters, but we didn't have, of course, a giant female rock band. The only bummer about this episode, kind of a throwback, is when the 2 groups figured out the way to win this contest, of course, is to combine, since there are 4 girls and 4 boys. All of a sudden, the 4 girls who played their own instruments in their own band are go-go dancers in the boys' band. So, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It happens, it happens. But I'm impressed with the women that I found on the show. I really didn't expect that. In a way that I could do a whole nother talk on the Big Bang Theory and what happened to the women on that show who all started out as neuroscientists and then became just nuts about Sheldon, which is fine, but yeah, that's a whole nother story. Anyway, obviously popular culture, which we're here to celebrate, mattered on the Monkees. They were a moment in popular culture. a moment that has lasted for the last 50 years. But a lot of what they did affected the other popular culture we know. Some people do or don't know that when they added the Chekhov character to Star Trek in their second season, Gene Roddenberry said he needs to have a haircut that matches that kid on the Monkees, because he's here to appeal to the young girls, right? So if you think about it, that's considered a hippie long hair haircut. Obviously, they made money for all the magazines of the day through all their events. This is Mickey with who? Davy with who?
Sissy Spacek.
Close. Sally Field. Sally Field of Gidget fame at that time. Gidget had been on the season before. She's going to move into the Flying Nun right after that. This is Mickey with his wife Samantha Just. This is Davy with his first wife. And then this is Nesmith with his first wife Phyllis and their son. So they're all over these magazines. So they're beginning to sell things outside of the television show. So the program is very important commercially. It's making money for a lot of people. They do commercials on the show, right? Sponsorships, look at me. I'm eating Rice Krispies. Sure, maybe, I don't know. But they're there. You could get an album off the back of your cereal box, and it would actually play on a record player, which is pretty cool. And if you go to like antique stores and whatnot now, people sell this stuff for way too much money when that was free. But again, a great way to show the value, the commercial value of the program. They were their own comic book. I'm sure somewhere in this place this weekend at one of the big comic cage upstairs might have a copy. I don't know. It's probably pretty rare. They were drawn by, who knows who the drawer, the artist? Hirschfeld, thank you very much. That's a huge thing that he would choose them, right? This was for a piece in TV Guide at the time, but he did all the great Broadway stars. So that's, and I just think that's quite beautiful.
Is his daughter's name in there somewhere?
You know, it should be, and I think it's in Peter's hair, I think, or it might be at the end of Mike's hair, but it's got to be in his hair somewhere. He always does the name Nina, which is his daughter's name. That's a fun fact of Hirschfeld. And if you go online, you can Google Hirschfeld Nina, and it'll show all the photos where her name appears. So I'm guessing, if we looked hard enough, it'd be in there. So they're making it all over popular culture. Obviously, there's other Hirschfelds where you can see more of the, and look at all the famous people that he's covered, that they're in that world. Nina's definitely in Marilyn Monroe's skirt. Their popular culture travels through the decades, and this is why people start going, why is anyone still talking about them? The show is canceled. The show's over, it's done. But it's not, right? In the 70s, the show was rerun on Saturday mornings, so another level of fandom came to them as children watching Saturday morning TV. So of course, Davy is still a big name. So he comes on to the Brady Bunch because Marcia has written a letter asking him to come and perform at her prom, and he doesn't get it on time. He didn't get fast enough, and then eventually he gets told about it, and then he decides to be her date, which is adorable, and is apparently the most rerun episode of television ever, of any rerun. Gilligan's Island, this one episode has been rerun more than any other. Which meant that Davy was also then voted the #1 teen idol of all time at a certain point. So that's a big deal. In the 70s, we're going to be on Laugh-In. At this point, Peter has left the band. Once the show is off the air, Peter leaves the band. So now they're trying to do it as a threesome, so check us out. Look at how much more 75, hippie-eyed their stuff is, right? So they're still being talked about in the 70s. In the 80s, we're going to have the MTV Marathon, the Pleasant Valley Sunday, so a 20th anniversary of the show. All of a sudden, a new generation of kids are introduced to it. I have a photo of Rachel Maddow because she interviewed Peter after the death of Davy Jones. And she said to him, as a child of the 80s, I learned what it was like to be a kid in the 60s through watching reruns of your show. That's how I learned what it was like. And I thought, how interesting was that as it's going through the decades? And of course, the Monkees, as they tour today, they're in New Zealand this week, actually. It's just Mike and Mickey now. They will say that they have grandmothers, mothers, daughters, and they're getting down to great-granddaughters pretty soon. They have a very wide fandom, which is a big deal. That you can watch on YouTube. I would have played, but I didn't want to mess with the technology, which is adorable. Ringo starts it. He's like, I'm going to get the boys together. I think I can do it. It's going to be wonderful. We're going to do a thing no one's ever done before. And then you cut to it, and it's eat our pizza backwards because the cheese is in the crust. And it's these guys. And then he looks up and he goes, wrong guys. But they never once mention who the Monkees are. They assume you know. They assume you understand that you had the Beatles and the Monkees, and there was this fake rivalry, because in fact they were all buddies. In the 80s, they get a star on the Walk of Fame in Hollywood for the television show, not for the music, which is interesting. You can have a star for 5 different things: radio, TV, film, vaudeville, whatnot. So this is pretty cool. So that's all of them showing up. That's when they decide to do the retouring. They're still obviously famous, and this year they just came out with an Archie comic that blended the Monkees into it. And of course the Archies are big again now because of what TV show? Riverdale. So all of a sudden everything is going in circles and this 60s comic is popular again. And I often say to younger audiences when I talk to them, they may never have heard of the Monkees, but they know one of the Monkees songs by heart because they saw this movie. And you start singing it and they all know it. And I didn't know that was a Monkees song. Again, who wrote that song? Close. No. They're major songwriters for them. Yeah. Neil Diamond. That's a Neil Diamond song. And in concert recently, people have asked him to sing it, and he says, no, that's Mickey Dolenz' song. I wrote it, but it doesn't belong to me anymore. Which is, again, a musician complimenting another musician. They do take each other seriously. In our current era, the Monkees have suddenly come around in all our popular culture. So many TV shows have been reference to them because the people making television now are the people who were little when they were watching the show, whether it be the 60s and 70s. So they've been riffed on, they've had music played on Breaking Bad, they've been riffed on in Mad Men. There was a marvelous moment in Grace and Frankie where they were discussing dumb things they did when they were younger. And Frankie says that she had sex with one of the Monkees, she just can't remember which one. Turns out to be Mickey. And you're like, wow, that just came out of nowhere, right? So I think that's pretty cool. But part of what made them last, we all know, it's the TV show and it's the music. The music mattered very much to them. There was, of course, in the beginning, the first 2 albums, the first 2 up there, More the Monkees and the Monkees, they sang everything. They played nothing. Not their faults. It was played by the Wrecking Crew, who were the band that played the Beach Boys albums for the Beach Boys. They played for lots of famous bands in the day. It's just that people got very angry that the Monkees were famous so quickly because they had a TV show. And so they got a bad reputation. But because of that reputation, the 3rd album, Headquarters, is entirely them. Every song is written by one of the 4 of them, every tune is sung by all of them, and all the instrumentation is all of them. They have nothing else. That is to prove they could do it. That album was second the entire summer of 68. The first album all summer was Sgt. Pepper's. That's not too shabby. If you think about it, if there wasn't Sgt. Pepper, they would have been #1 the whole summer. So that's how much the music mattered. It was quite a good album. There was quite a lot of good music on that album. Speaking of the Beatles, as I said, they actually didn't know each other. They hung out with each other. They respected each other. When Davy Jones died, there was a clip of Paul McCartney, and he was doing a little "Here They Come" bit and going, you know, I remember them. I like them. It's all cool. So they were respected by lots of people. Peter himself attended the Monterey Pop Festival with Mickey Dolenz, who's not in this picture. Again, behind him, as we said. But also, at the Pop Festival is when they met this young, really great guitar player who they invited to come along as the opening act to their concerts the next season. And his name was Jimi Hendrix. And they thought he was so flamboyant and so much of a character that it would match the characters they were playing. Except after about 6 or 7 concerts he quit because all the kids were doing was yelling, please bring Davy on stage. And they didn't recognize the quality of Jimi Hendrix. So he left. He was never angry at them, and they were friends. And obviously, sadly, he died just a couple of years later. But there's some great photographs of them sitting in hotel rooms together, riffing and playing. And again, all respecting each other's work. So I think that's really cool. Obviously, as I said, the TV writers, the music writers matter, right? I mean, Carole King has how many Grammys in her day? And she wrote Sometime in the Morning, which I think is one of the most beautiful love songs ever, right? Voice and Heart, as you mentioned, were the major songwriters for them in the first couple of years, and then it's expanded. Neil Sedaka wrote for them, Neil Diamond, I love that young picture of Neil Diamond. Paul Williams, who also, somehow the Muppets and the Monkees, I need to find a way, I need a book that connects them, because there's a lot that connects them. David Gates from Bread. Wrote a couple of songs, and actually Mickey has an album he does a new album called Remember, and in that he records Diary, which is a famous David Gates song, which David wrote and tried to sell to him in the late 70s, and he said, no, I don't think I'm a singer anymore. So he did that later in his career. But that's how important, and Carol Baker Sager, of course. So they knew that writers were an important thing. And of course the music still matters, because 2 years ago they put out a album on their 50th anniversary that made the top 50 in the Billboard charts 50 years after their last top 10 album. No other artist can say that. No other living artist, right? If you put out dead people's stuff, then it'll sell again. But no other living artist. And the people that wrote for them in this album, again, very major modern songwriters. So I think that's really, really cool. Rivers Cuomo, Andrew Partridge, Ben Gibbard wrote a beautiful song called Me and Magdalena, which is just a very, very gorgeous song that Nesmith sings. I mean, these are all major people today, and what they did, the folks at Rhino Records went out and asked people from hit rock bands today, if you could write for the Monkees, would you? And a bunch of them said yes. And then they said, okay, write me a song that sounds like a Monkee song. And that was a great challenge for them. They really, really enjoyed it. Ben Gibbard sings Me and Magdalena when he's on. Whoops, sorry, I got one. Sorry. Fandom matters on the Monkees. There is Zilch is a podcast where every couple of weeks they put out a podcast. Lots of information about the show, interviews with the guys, updates on what's happening with them. I do a thing called Monkees 101 with another woman who's a PhD. We're both PhDs. And we take one episode at a time and sort of pick it apart, find all the stuff that's in it, talk about what was happening in history at that moment and in the music world at that moment. And it's really kind of fun. But they do a lot of really cool stuff. 7,000 or 8,000 people follow that one podcast just because of this fandom. And it's international. As I said, they're in New Zealand right now. They're going to Australia. They've been to Japan. They're everywhere. I've met them. Because fandom even means, like, people with PhDs want to pay attention to them. And this was on their last tour that that Peter and Nikki did together. And that's how fast I talk. That's how much I have to say. I have a lot more to say, but that's the prepared stuff. I thought that if people wanted to chat or had some questions about stuff, I would be glad to answer them. What interests people about why the Monkees are still famous?
Is it true that they like having music written for them?
They didn't like?
They didn't like having music written for them?
They did not in the beginning. That was, it was an unfair part of their contract. You know, again, as I said, what's funny is Mickey was an actor from childhood in Circus Boy. Davy had a Tony nomination for being in Oliver on Broadway. I mean, the kid had a Tony nomination. If he was alive today, if we were, this is one of my problems with Americans as audiences. Back in the day, we weren't quite Renaissance. We didn't understand that people could have many talents. So as soon as you were nailed for one thing, that's all we wanted you to do, right? My favorite example of this is Cher, right? First she's Cher from Sonny and Cher. Then she goes into acting and everyone says, you can't act, you're a rock and roll singer. And then she gets an Oscar nomination or two, and then she wins an Oscar for Moonstruck, and she says, I'm gonna go back on the rock and roll trail and do a concert. And they're like, you can't do concerts, you're an actress. And so she goes out and does these award-winning sellout concerts, and then she wants to go back to act. You can't be, I was like, can we not adjust to the fact that people have more than one talent? I think if Davy were alive today, he would be basically Neil Patrick Harris, who we've allowed to be a child star, a Broadway star, you know, come back and do a silly TV sitcom. He's been allowed to run the gamut because we recognize that people can have more than one talent. So when they brought these guys in, what happened was Davy and Mickey had acting performance and some singing. Mike and Peter had been folk singers, and they'd been at the Troubadour, which is a famous club in Los Angeles, and they'd come through Greenwich Village. They showed up ready to use their instruments and perform, but it was too late. All the tracks had been already laid. The people who produced the show did not expect them to take part in that way. So it was very disappointing to them, but they're like, well, my contract was to be an actor, so I'm playing a singer, I'll come in and I'll sing the part and figure out what I do from there. Nesmith had written some songs before and sold some. He wrote Different Drum for Linda Ronstadt and sold that to her just before he got the job on the Monkees. So when he did his contract, he said he wanted the right to have the B side of the various, you remember the day we put out singles, he wanted the B side. Whatever the A side was going to go to a famous songwriter, but he wanted a song on the B side because he ain't stupid. When the record sells, he gets part of the profits. So that was his way of sneaking in his musicality, and that's why after a couple of albums they were able to say, look, we can clearly do this, you have to give us a chance. What's funny is, before the producers and the people at the network really believed they could, For the purpose of publicity, they sent them to do a live concert. But they sent them to Honolulu, Hawaii, because the press wouldn't follow them there, because they wouldn't be paid to travel there, and the press in Hawaii wouldn't be reprinted in New York and LA and the major cities. So they figured if they flopped, they would lose nothing. And instead, they were a huge hit. And once they had done it on stage several times, they started talking to themselves about, look, we're already doing this. We should do it on the albums. And so it caused a little ruckus. There's a guy named Don Kirshner who's very famous as a music producer back in the day. He was in charge of all of this. He hired all the songwriters. That's really quite brilliant work that he did, and he had a good ear for what would sell. But he did not want his power infringed on in any way. So it was either him or Mike Nesmith, and Nesmith also had that sort of stubbornness about, I want to be in charge. And gee whiz, if you didn't give it to Nesmith and he quit the show, you lost the actor that already had a following. If you lost Don Kirshner, you haven't lost anybody that will harm the audience. So they had to really think about keeping the audience for the show safe. So all of these machinations are going on in the backstage. Well, they're all like having to get up every day, show up on set, work for 14 hours. People forget how much time it takes to film a television show, especially this one, which had tons and tons of directing. They changed camera angles all the time for that fast cuteness. In fact, when they did the pilot and they tested it in pilot audiences, it was one of the lowest ranking pilots ever. You'll hear that again when Seinfeld shows up, right? Seinfeld almost never got in the air because it was a low ranking pilot. They gave Frawley a night to re-edit to see if he could make it better. And he made all these crazy, quick shots. And they also, to the pilot, which you can see all the shows. You should buy them, but you can see them all on YouTube, actually. They put their acting auditions onto the pilot, two of them, Mike's and Davy's, because they felt that one of the things they got from the test audience was because they were all long-haired boys, nobody could tell them apart. And I'm like, I think I can tell the difference between them. There's a couple tall ones, but the one guy, yeah, and he wore a hat, and he's blonde, and he's short, and so putting the acting auditions at the end made the audience recognize them and then feel like they understood who they were. So all of this stuff was going on in order to make the show work, right? But I mean, think about it. They worked 14-hour days. Then they had to go to a studio and record voice music, whatever that was they were chosen to do, and then go home and crash and come back and do it again and do it again and do it again. There's a great bit in some interviews with Mickey where he'll say he did not understand how famous they had become until the first Christmas after the show debuted in September. And he was a San Fernando Valley kid, and that's where I happen to live. And it was Christmas time, and he wanted to buy presents for his family. So he went to the local mall to go shopping for his mom and his sister. And he started to walk into the main hall of the mall, and all these people started stampeding toward him. And he thought, oh my God, there's a fire. So he ran back to the door and he opened it to help people escape. And then they started jumping on him and he realized, oh my God, they're here for me. And he didn't know how to deal with that because it happened so quickly. And they've been so wrapped up in work, they hadn't noticed the magazines and things like that. Nobody knew that it was happening that way. So it was a very heady experience for all of them. It took them those couple of albums to go, hey, wait, we'll put a little stopper in that. We have a plan. We would like to do this other thing. And by then they had enough power to do it. It's all about that, right? You have to get to that level, basically. Cool. Yeah?
What's your favorite album, the Monkees' discography?
The scary thing is now I would say Headquarters, because I really love that album and I listen to it a lot in my car. And I do love Good Times. I think they did great work on that new album. There's a great song, I Wasn't Born to Follow, which Peter sings on Good Times, which is the moment for me that he gets to be the folk musician he always intended to be. It's such a perfectly pure song. But in fact, for most of my life, my favorite album was their most despised album, More of the Monkees. And they hated that one because it was put out before, they weren't even told about it. They recorded so much music for the first one they didn't even know, and this one was put together sort of behind their back, and then bam, there was this, and it came in #2 on the Billboard charts. So it was successful, but none of them appreciated that. So, but that's probably the first album of theirs I had, which I still have, and my cousin and I would play that in my basement on an old record player forever and ever and ever. It's got this, probably one of the least liked songs of their whole catalog, which is Davy doing The Day I Fell in Love. and it's just a prose poem. But my cousin could listen to that for hours, right? Because he was proposing to her as far as she was concerned. And it has she, and I mean, it has some good songs on it that they still play in concert, because they're very good about, when they did their concerts over the years, there's another great interview with Mickey where when the show finally was canceled and stuff didn't happen for them as a band, he moved to England, of course he's married a woman from England, and he became a director, a TV director. In fact, he was sort of on the path to be Ron Howard. He became a very, very popular director in England, did some programs that are very popular there. One's called Metal Mickey, not named after him at all. It's a robot named Mickey, but he's the producer and the director of it. And then when they came calling for the 80s concert, his wife, at that point sadly his second wife, because his first marriage had fallen apart, said, and they had 3 daughters, she's like, let's go on a tour of America so your kids can see where you're from for this summer, and you'll just play concerts, and we'll hang out and we'll see, all the cool cities. So he agreed, and he left the directing career thinking it was taking a hiatus for the summer, and it was the #1 most profitable concert of 1986. So then everybody's like, let's do it again next year, let's do it again next year. And all of a sudden he became a concert performer again and left the directing behind. And I think that's kind of, I'd love to know if he ever misses that, because really he was on the trajectory. Ron Howard wasn't stupid. He knew he was going bald and he wasn't going to be a sex symbol in the movies, so he figured out how the cameras worked and he got himself an Oscar, right? So you sort of have to make choices when your show goes away. You have to look at the real world. So I just think it's really interesting that what I love, they don't love, and that just happens that way sometimes. Cool, yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk more about the Monkees movie Head and all the people involved with it, like Jack Nicholson, the connection to Easy Rider.
Yes. Well, I mean, you can go backwards and say, look, Rafelson, right, who's putting it together, they're going to end up doing all this, and Paul Mazursky, who wrote the pilot, and Larry Tucker. These guys were all, one of the things, I probably should do a whole slide on that, the Monkees kind of funded the independent 60s filmmakers of that era, because they used the money they made from the show to produce Head. They used the money from Head failed, so it didn't make a ton, to then go and do Easy Rider and Move. We're going to do, not Go West Alice, the other one, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. So much is going to happen through this experience. Head is fascinating. There are teachers in America, film teachers, who teach it as the first and possibly the only surrealistic American film. Right? That's more a French thing. We never quite get that in America. But Head is truly surrealistic. And they will admit that it was created by all 5 of them sitting around getting high in Ojai, California at a big retreat with Jack Nicholson, who was a friend of Bob Rafelson's. He lived nearby. He was an actor who hadn't gotten anywhere yet. He's like, well, let me try writing and see if that'll work. And they just riffed a bunch of crazy stuff and wrote it all down, and they were all so high, nobody thought whether or not it made any sense. And then they had the money to put it together, so they did. It's fascinating because some people love it, some people hate it. More and more people are coming to appreciate it and to study it. It is a deconstruction of celebrity in America. They might not have thought of that when they put it together. They might not have, as a normal film is written or a TV show, you start with a theme and what's a story that will highlight this theme and where do I go from there? And they kind of just put it all together. But because that's what was uppermost in all of their minds, what is happening with this concept of a celebrity and who are we really now? I mean, one of the things I do in the book is a whole chapter on identity construction, which is sort of academic, but really interesting because, again, it goes to the Renaissance business too. These 4 guys were people in their own right. Then they were characters on a show. Then they were performers on stage who were a little different than on the show. Then there were the people in 16 magazine, right, at some point who even lied about whether they were married or not. Davey couldn't admit he was married for about a year because nobody, you're not supposed to like a boy who's married. That would make you feel like you were an adulterating little girl. So they wouldn't want you to know that the boy you should like is married, right? So meanwhile, you're like getting on planes with the guys and your wife is walking with one of your roadies, right, and pretending that she doesn't know you. So there's that persona. And then this business of persona is what got a lot in their way of moving forward after the Monkees. It was very difficult for people to take them seriously. Again, Peter Tork was thought to be stupid. He must be a dummy. And the real sad thing there is that Treva Silverman, when I interviewed her, she said, as they thought about the characters on the show, you knew Davey was a cute one. That's just, hello, he was cute, okay? Mike's gonna be the father figure. He's tall. He's got that sort of stoic dad thing about him. Mickey's the goofball, right? You gotta have the funny guy. Peter could have been one of two things. There are stock characters when you're putting a show together that you think about. He could have either been the super intelligent, socially awkward one, so really kind of Sheldon before Sheldon, or he could be the dummy. And the writers in the room, as they were brainstorming, kind of went, it's so much easier to write the dummy stuff, let's do that. So suddenly this man who's deeply intelligent is playing a dummy, and he's doing it so well that for a good 20, 30 years afterwards, nobody's taking him seriously. And that's really, I think, a shame and unfair. So Head becomes this deconstruction of what celebrity did to them and how they were feeling at the time. And of course, it's got some anti-war themes going on in there, a lot because they thought of the war as a commodity that was being sold to them, sold to the public. So it's fascinating. It took me years to, I didn't really like it when I first saw it because I really didn't understand it. And their mistake was they wanted so desperately to be different, they made a film that wasn't something that their typical audience could go see, and an older audience didn't take them seriously enough to think it was worth seeing. So it didn't make any money, and it was sort of the, the final piece that broke them up, which I think is sad. Again, I don't think that as a product, I don't think, they didn't have a manager. A lot of them will say that. There was no one who managed them as a group. They each had their own people in some way, but not much. Davey lost some money to a few fake managers, and Mickey will always say he got lucky. He never lost his money because his mother was his manager. And having been an actress herself, the minute he started making money, she was like, here's how you get these accounts, here's where you invest in this, here's how you do that. And Nesmith will admit that he spent the money on cars, and it all disappeared. And he was pretty much dirt broke for a long time, and then he inherited a bunch of his mother's money because she invented. Exactly. But she put her money into a foundation because she knew that her son was really good at losing money. And she allowed him to run the foundation, which gave charity money to single mothers, because she had been a single mother, in business. So he got to play with money, but he couldn't spend it on himself. So he had to invent ways to make money, which is how he got into filmmaking, right, a little bit, and that sort of moved him, and he eventually got back into being. He's probably now the richest of all of them. But he was not for a while. So the fact that nobody was there managing them as a group, as you would as the Rolling Stones had a manager, as the Beatles had managers, it let everything all go sort of flighty. And the fact that nobody in TV figured out what else to do with them. If they'd done a music show, that would have been really interesting. Peter had Janis Joplin signed up to be a guest star on the show. Each year they would have a guest star, and she was going to come to the third season, which never happened. Had they done a vaudevillain type show, she would have. Or, even later, figuring out who they were. Mike decided not to try acting anymore, though he's appeared in a couple of things like Portlandia recently. Davey tried to get back to Broadway. Nobody's taken him seriously. Again, that Neil Patrick Harris thing. Nowadays, you'd be like, oh, yay for him. And Mickey thought, well, I'm an actor. I was in one show. I was in a second show. I need to do another show. But everyone, if you walked in the room, was like, well, what are you doing here? You're a musician. It's a well-known, Henry Winkler has talked about this, when he went to audition to be Fonzie on Happy Days, the only guy in the room was Mickey Dolenz. And he went home to his wife, Henry Winkler went home to his wife and said, well, I'm never going to get this, Mickey Dolenz was there. And they didn't hire Mickey Dolenz because they said, everyone will look at you and they won't see this character we've created, they'll see Mickey, and we don't want that. So his persona kept him from going into making a new persona, which actors always have to think about. How am I going to get past that? So Head was that. And I think as an adult and as someone who studies media, I understand it now. I find the nuances to it. But it was the wrong thing to do at the wrong time if they were trying to expand their career. Cool. Yeah.
I had a question on the, you mentioned vaudeville was the idea of a variety show, whatever. Would that apply to the Monkees or apply to their production people? That, I think, would be
I know, it seems like, but the people who were in charge of the network didn't envision that rock and roll would be successful on mainstream television. And right there, Sonny and Cher came afterwards. If they had only come first, but they didn't. Coslo Johnson, who is the twin brother of Artie Johnson from Laugh-In, Coslo goes on to work for the Sonny and Cher show and Laugh-In. He ends up winning a couple of Emmys for being on those staffs. So clearly they had even the talent in place in the writing pool to have created the kind of program. And because they could do the musical interludes, they could invite their friends, and they could do the cute comedy stuff, it seems to me it would have been an easy guess. But again, TV they weren't thinking about the new generation. They were still thinking we're selling Dean Martin, who I love the Dean Martin show, right? But even Dean Martin was all farcical and crazy. So they didn't recognize the possibilities, which I think is a loss. Oh, cool. Got 5 minutes, who's left? Yeah.
Can you talk examples off the top of your head, if you have any, about other political things that they worked in?
You mean into the show? In one episode, Mike walks in, he's meeting the president of a company to get a job, but he doesn't know it's the president of the company, so he walks in and he says, "Oh, Mr. President, I'm really a fan of your war on poverty." So he's talking to Lyndon Johnson, right? And then he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, wrong guy," right? So that's cute. They do a whole episode on machines taking the place, the jobs of people, right? And poor Peter can't manage it, and Mike beats it, but it's all about machination and what's going on and how it's going to take jobs away from people. They do the whole episode that has to do with aliens who are landing, and are they taking over America, and the military is trying to stop them, and how do we handle invasions? And that gets very political because they have Pat Paulson, who's going to do the whole, I'm running for president, when he's on Laugh-In, and he's standing by a big flag, and he's talking about America and how it all should be, and that's where I get the riff from the teenagers. They're the ones causing all the trouble because they're fighting. We don't want them around. We have to stop this. So they did that. They did a few sly anti-war things like that when you aren't really paying attention. Yeah. So when you watch it, pretty much I'd say every couple episodes you catch a moment, you're like, how'd they get away with that? Which is cool. Very cool. Anybody? Yes?
Along with the political question you mentioned, it seemed that, was it really rated G when it came out?
Well, the problem was we were still moving out of the era.
When they did the beginning of war scene.
Right.
Before that was when the Southern Vietnamese
Yeah.
captain shot the Indian in the head and then led in a circle of sky. I mean, were parents just picking up their kids and running out of the theater? Because it was in the first 10 minutes.
The problem is parents weren't taking the kids to see it because they didn't know about it really. It didn't even have their pictures on the poster for advertising, and it wasn't put out as something that would be another episode of the show. So yeah, one, parents weren't taking the kids in the first place, so nobody was showing up, and yeah, that's the problem. Yeah.
Real quick follow-up on the head thing. Was it perhaps the fault of the distributors? Do you think that it didn't get exposure? Because I've seen the record cover, it's just a plain silver.
It's the plain silver print, yeah.
They didn't want to associate
with the TV show.
Family friendlies, Monkees, with
Yeah.
the thing that they produce.
Exactly.
It's so weird, but at the time, I guess that made sense. Who distributed it?
Raffleson and Schneider did it through their
They
company,
sabotaged.
Raybrooke Productions. They did it through their own company. They sabotaged themselves. Now, there are some people that posit really what they were doing was they were killing the Monkees so they themselves as producers would be taken seriously to move into things like Easy Rider. And Jack Nicholson didn't care. He just needed money. He wasn't the Jack Nicholson we know, right? So, yeah, he didn't really care. And so, yeah, even if it had great distribution. I don't think they knew what audience they had at that moment, which is too bad because when they knew what their audience was, they appealed to it. And they clearly continue to appeal to it to the modern day. All right, they're waving me at me, so I guess I have to say thank you so much for coming. That was fun to hang out with the Monkees. They're my guys. If anybody's interested, I have copies. Yay, have a lovely day. Enjoy the rest of the con. It's been fun.